Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. December 22nd, 2023. It was supposed to be a calm Friday morning in Aiea, Hawaii, a few days before Christmas. The kind of morning where most people are wrapping gifts, grabbing coffee, and making casual plans for the weekend. The Pearl Ridge Center Mall was already buzzing with shoppers by 9 o'clock a.m. But in less than 5 minutes, a gunshot would echo through its parking structure and turn the last days of one woman's life into a homicide file. The victim was a 33-year-old mother. Her young daughter watched the entire incident from just a few feet away. The shooter walked away, not fled, not ran, walked. Within hours, the Honolulu Police Department activated homicide protocols. And within minutes, crime scene investigators began bagging the evidence that would open one of the most disturbing domestic violence cases the state had seen in years. What made this case different wasn't just the location or the timing or even the presence of a child. What made it different was that the victim had already asked for help. She had followed every legal step. She had warned authorities. And still, she died in broad daylight with a restraining order in place. By 9:12 a.m., emergency units had taped off the east wing parking structure of Pearl Ridge. Mall security had already evacuated the level above and sealed access points. Surveillance footage from Level 3, captured from a west-facing camera angled toward the pedestrian ramp, showed the first responder arriving with a trauma kit, already aware it was a gunshot wound to the chest. The victim was identified as Teresa, a local business owner and public figure on Instagram, known by the handle @BunnyBontiti. She was pronounced dead at the scene from multiple gunshot wounds. She had arrived that morning with her daughter, reportedly to meet her mother for breakfast. The shooter was described as a male in his 40s, medium build, last seen wearing a gray hoodie and black pants. A witness who had been walking to her car just 20 feet away told investigators, quote, "He wasn't yelling. He didn't look panicked. He just said something short to her, then pulled the gun. 1, 2, 3 shots. Then he turned and left. I didn't see a getaway car. He just disappeared into the lower lot." Initial forensic examination at the scene located 3 .380 caliber casings grouped within a 6-foot radius. Blood spatter analysis indicated close-range discharge, less than 4 feet. One bullet entered through the left clavicle, another through the abdomen, and a final, fatal shot through the right temple. All 3 were recovered from the scene. Her daughter, age 11, was physically unharmed, but in acute psychological shock. She was transported with a trauma response team to Kapiolani Medical Center for Women and Children. At the time of the shooting, Teresa was under an active temporary restraining order, TRO, against a known male subject. The order had been granted 2 days earlier on December 20th. It had specified that the subject was to have no contact with Teresa or her children and was to remain at least 100 feet from any location where she could reasonably be expected to be present. The fact that the attack occurred anyway, not at home, not at work, but in a public shopping center, immediately raised concerns about enforcement failure and access to firearms. Investigators from HPD's Major Crimes Division conducted a rapid evidence sweep. Witness statements, vehicle logs, and mall surveillance were immediately gathered. Mall cameras were operational and had clear footage of the vehicle Teresa arrived in, a blue 2017 Honda CR-V, and partial visual confirmation of the suspect, though the face was not clearly visible due to hood obstruction. The shooter was seen on camera walking toward Teresa's parked vehicle from a blind corner near a concrete pillar. He approached on foot, stayed within a 10-second window of interaction, discharged the firearm 3 times, and left through a different exit ramp. There was no chase, no confrontation, and no immediate arrest. The timeline was fast. Too fast. Investigators noted that the suspect would have had to know Teresa's location in advance. He would have needed to position himself before she arrived. That made this premeditated, not reactionary, not spontaneous. At 12:37 p.m., a bolo, be on the lookout, was issued for Jason Cachuela, age 44. Known address, Waipahu. Known vehicle, gray, 2008, Toyota 4Runner. Registered spouse of the deceased. At 3:49 p.m., his vehicle was located 3 miles from the original crime scene, parked on a residential street in Waipahu. Inside, officers found Jason dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The weapon recovered at the scene was a compact, unregistered .380 caliber handgun, matching the casings found at the mall. What wasn't clear yet was how Jason had acquired the weapon, or why, despite a TRO in effect and documented mental health concerns, he was still free and unsupervised. Even more disturbing, on December 8th, just 2 weeks before her death, Teresa had submitted her restraining order paperwork with specific warnings. She reported that Jason had once hid under her car, had made repeated suicide threats in front of their children, and was in possession of firearms. Yet according to HPD, no firearm was registered under his name, and no arrest was made at the time of her filings. In towns like Aiea, murders aren't just crimes, they fracture the illusion of safety, especially when the person screaming for help is left to face their killer alone. Teresa's death wasn't just tragic. It wasn't just preventable. It was a collapse of every safeguard she had put in place. And the forensic trail, from shell casings to surveillance footage to the suicide weapon, told a story that didn't need any imagination, just an honest look at what failed. Before the crime scene tape went up, before the medical examiner signed the death report, and before the forensic team collected a single shell casing, Teresa Cachuela was known to tens of thousands simply as Bunny. Online, she was the face of lighthearted content, beauty tutorials, family snapshots, and scripture quotes. She ran a wellness and aesthetics business in Pearl City, often sharing affirmations like, "Heal through faith," or "Your peace is your power." Her Instagram page, @BunnyBontiti, had over 19,000 followers. Her brand was built around optimism and transformation. But digital image rarely reflects domestic reality. And the deeper investigators looked into Teresa's life beyond the screen, the more clear it became. She was managing a private threat that had escalated out of control. Detectives from HPD's Major Crimes Division initiated a digital forensics warrant on the day of her murder. The court-authorized search extended to her iPhone, iCloud account, and public social profiles. The device was unlocked at the scene using Apple's Face ID as her phone was recovered less than 2 feet from her body. Digital timeline analysis revealed a series of encrypted WhatsApp messages, many unread, from a contact listed as Jason C. 2 messages sent the night before the shooting read, "You took everything. That ends tomorrow. If I can't see my daughter, you don't get to either." The messages were time-stamped at 11:48 p.m. and 12:04 a.m., respectively. Teresa had not opened either. 1 hour before her death, she posted a story to her business page showing her holding her daughter's hand in the car with the caption, "Mall morning with my little best friend." Prior to the shooting, Teresa had taken multiple legal steps to disengage from what she privately described to friends as emotional terrorism. She had been living separately from her husband for approximately 5 months. She had initiated divorce proceedings but had not finalized custody agreements. Court documents revealed that on December 8, 2023, Teresa filed for a temporary restraining order, TRO. The filing included a sworn affidavit citing multiple incidents, stalking, threats of self-harm, and acts of intimidation that occurred in front of their 3 children. The affidavit was detailed. She alleged that Jason had hidden under her vehicle to ambush her after work and had previously followed her between business appointments. What stood out to investigators wasn't just the behavior, it was the pattern. The same tactics had occurred more than once. Surveillance logs subpoenaed from Teresa's spa location showed her vehicle circling the parking lot multiple times across different dates, with an unregistered sedan tailing close behind. At least one plate number matched a vehicle linked to Jason. Teresa had recorded a voice memo dated December 5th, later recovered from her iCloud backup, where she said, "I don't know how much longer I can pretend this is just going to stop. I'm doing what the law says. I'm documenting everything. If anything happens to me, I tried." That voice file is now evidence. It wasn't a cry for attention. It was documentation, meticulously built, anticipating what might come. Her public life, meanwhile, showed no indication of danger. Her last 5 posts before the incident included a business promotion, a quote from Proverbs, a skincare giveaway, and 2 photos with her daughter. In one, she smiled with her back to a Christmas tree lit in pink. In another, she wore a t-shirt that read, "Peace over panic." This was not an individual ignoring red flags. This was a woman living within constraints, legal, financial, and social. The digital world offered her a safe space. Reality, increasingly, did not. What we don't always see when we scroll through curated posts is the insulation victims create, not just to protect their reputation, but to protect themselves. Because in cases like these, perception can be a shield, and sometimes it's the only one they have. When Teresa's friends were contacted by law enforcement after the murder, several confirmed she had expressed concern about being followed. One friend, a fellow esthetician, mentioned that Teresa had stopped posting locations in real time and only shared family outings after they occurred. It was a tactic rooted in fear. Investigators logged this as relevant behavior modification, an indication that she was actively trying to limit her digital trace. In interviews with HPD, a digital crimes analyst noted, her patterns suggest an awareness of being watched, not paranoia, calculated adjustments. That distinction matters. It matters because the timeline leading to her murder didn't begin at the mall. It started months earlier, through a slow erosion of safety that left her waiting for the law to catch up. And it never did. Digital forensics further revealed that Teresa had used a safety app, Noonlight, on her phone, which allows users to press and hold a trigger button if they feel unsafe. If released without the PIN code, emergency services are contacted. Her app was open on screen at the time of her death, but the trigger had not been activated. Whether she didn't see the danger coming in time or whether she didn't want to scare her daughter by reaching for the phone is unclear. But what's clear is this: by the time shots were fired, every warning had already been issued. In every domestic homicide case, there's a point where the paper trail intersects with real-time failure. In this case, it happened on December 20th, 2023, exactly 2 days before the shooting. The court documents are clear. At 8:45 a.m., Teresa Cachuela appeared before the family court of the First Circuit in Honolulu. She submitted a sworn affidavit requesting a temporary restraining order against her estranged husband. The filing was 13 pages long, structured with specific dates, locations, and behavioral details. It included physical descriptions of prior threats, instances of property damage, and claims of stalking behavior involving shared minor children. One line stood out: "He has threatened suicide in front of our daughter. He hides near my car. He's unstable. He owns firearms." The order was granted the same day. On paper, Teresa was protected. The court prohibited the respondent from approaching her, contacting her, or possessing any firearm. A hearing date was set for the following month, but enforcement, as in many civil protection cases, relied almost entirely on voluntary compliance, unless a violation occurred. In other words, unless he showed up and was caught, there were no real-time consequences. HPD confirmed that upon receiving the TRO, they logged it into their internal system and issued a courtesy notification to the respondent. Standard procedure. No arrest was made. No further action was taken to remove firearms from the residence because none were registered in his name. Investigators later confirmed that at least one visit had been made to the respondent's home after the TRO was issued. Officers spoke briefly with him through the screen door, confirmed receipt of the court order, and left. No entry was made, no search was conducted, no weapon was recovered. A decision was made based on procedural assumptions that the respondent would comply and that no credible threat was present. In retrospect, that contact marked a critical opportunity lost. Forensic investigators reviewing the TRO found that Teresa had included 5 incidents from the previous 60 days. These included one occasion where the respondent was seen circling her workplace 3 times in a 2-hour period, a confrontation in a grocery store parking lot, a voicemail threatening to make Christmas different this year, a report of him hiding under her vehicle outside her spa, an instance of him showing up unannounced to a parent-teacher meeting despite being asked not to attend. Each of these was independently documented, some through police reports, others through witness statements. Taken alone, they suggested harassment. Taken together, they forecast escalation. Digital records confirmed Teresa submitted the TRO electronically, accompanied by video files, text message screenshots, and a copy of a letter her daughter wrote to her school counselor, describing fear of Daddy's voice. The family court judge reviewed the materials and approved the order under standard guidelines. However, the system had no real mechanism to verify the claims beyond documentation, and without a violation caught in real time, no enforcement tools were activated. In the days following the homicide, HPD came under scrutiny for their limited response to Teresa's warnings. Spokespeople stated that no arrest was warranted because no crime had occurred at the time of reporting. The firearm reportedly used in the shooting was not registered to any known person or address. It was, by definition, invisible to the system. What investigators did find, after accessing the suspect's online activity, was a search history indicating prior knowledge of restraining order statutes and state gun laws. In particular, browser data included the query, "Can you still own a gun after a TRO Hawaii?" The search was logged 3 days before the murder. The answer to that question isn't straightforward. Under Hawaii state law, a TRO can trigger removal of firearms only when a judge specifically orders seizure. In Teresa's case, no such order was issued. There was no known registry match, so no removal occurred. From a procedural standpoint, every action followed protocol. From a human standpoint, it wasn't enough. One senior investigator on the case, who asked not to be named publicly, reviewed the sequence and remarked, "We didn't miss a detail on paper, but something was missing in judgment. We knew what she feared. We just couldn't act before the trigger was pulled." It's a line investigators don't say lightly. Because in cases like this, prevention is rarely about not knowing. It's about not having the tools to act early. Teresa documented everything. She went through the process. She filed correctly, provided supporting material, attended her court date, and complied with every legal recommendation. And 2 days later, she was dead. 2 days. That was the window between Teresa Cachuela receiving a court-approved restraining order and the moment she was shot in front of her daughter at Pearl Ridge Center. Investigators from the Honolulu Police Department's homicide detail reconstructed the timeline with precision. Teresa left her residence shortly after 8 o'clock a.m. on December 22, 2023, driving a 2017 blue Honda CR-V. Her destination was Pearl Ridge, where she was scheduled to meet her mother for breakfast and drop her daughter off for the holiday weekend. Surveillance footage captured her vehicle entering the parking structure from the Mauka side at 8:27 a.m. The mall's closed-circuit video system, comprising 16 camera angles within the parking facility, provided critical data points. Investigators noted that one camera in the northeast quadrant recorded a gray 2008 Toyota 4Runner parked against the far column at 7:54 a.m., a full 33 minutes before Teresa arrived. That vehicle remained idle. The engine turned off. No one exited. Motion logs reviewed by HPD's Digital Forensics Unit showed the suspect exited the vehicle only after Teresa's arrival. He moved deliberately, not in a rush, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and gloves. He kept his face lowered, avoiding the primary camera zone, but one camera on the B3 ramp captured a partial side profile, enough for investigators to later match posture and gait. There was no verbal exchange picked up by audio surveillance. The cameras, while high resolution, lacked audio in that quadrant. The duration of the encounter between Teresa and the shooter was under 12 seconds. Teresa was opening the back door of her vehicle. Her daughter was stepping out. The shooter approached from behind the adjacent pillar, raised a concealed weapon, and discharged 3 rounds from a .380 caliber pistol, one to the shoulder, one to the torso, one to the head. Investigators later noted the shot group was unusually tight, suggesting prior familiarity with firearms or, at minimum, close-range execution. The shooter then turned, walked back to the 4Runner, and drove off the lower ramp exit before emergency services even arrived. A security officer on duty near the elevator bank called 911 at 8:41 a.m., 90 seconds after the final gunshot. Paramedics arrived within 5 minutes. By then, Teresa was unresponsive. The child, in a dissociative state, was seated against a cement barrier. No one else was injured. Crime scene response was activated immediately. Investigators locked down the east quadrant and collected all casings, fibers, and trace materials. No shell casings were found beyond the immediate 6-foot perimeter. No fingerprints were recovered from the scene, consistent with the shooter's use of gloves. One recovered casing had a minor dent, leading ballistics to identify the pistol as a compact .380, likely from a non-registered ghost gun variant. What investigators didn't find was any indication of Teresa having made a defensive move. Her keys were still in hand. Her purse was still zipped. There was no sign of struggle, no sign she had even turned to face her attacker. It was fast, purposeful, clinical. Later that afternoon, HPD detectives reviewed Teresa's route to Pearl Ridge using traffic camera logs. No suspicious tailing vehicle was noted. License plate recognition software flagged no tracking pattern on her usual roads. This suggested premeditated staging rather than active pursuit, meaning the shooter arrived at the mall independently and waited, knowing her pattern. Cell tower triangulation confirmed that Teresa's phone last connected to a tower at 8:40 a.m., seconds before the signal dropped. Her phone was recovered at the scene. It had not been unlocked after 8:39. Her Noonlight safety app was open on screen, but the emergency activation had not been triggered. Investigators speculated she never had the chance to respond. The child was taken to Kapiolani Medical Center and later placed in the custody of Teresa's mother. She was not able to provide a statement that day. In follow-up forensic interviews conducted under child advocacy protocols, she confirmed that the man who approached the vehicle was someone she had seen before, but could not name aloud. The statement was sealed under juvenile protection orders. At this point in the investigation, the suspect had not yet been found. But HPD's evidence board was already clear this was not a random act. It was a planned hit, carried out in public, executed within a narrow window. The shooter knew when to show up, and who would be in that car. As one homicide investigator put it, he didn't just know her schedule. He knew the system wouldn't be ready. At 3:49 p.m. on December 22nd, 2023, roughly 7 hours after Teresa Cachuela was shot in a public parking structure, Honolulu police officers located a gray 2008 Toyota 4Runner parked on Como Mai Drive in Waipahu. The vehicle matched the bolo issued earlier that day. It was registered to Jason Cachuela. Patrol officers approached cautiously. The engine was off. The windows were fogged from the inside. There was no movement. One officer tapped the glass. No response. A second unit arrived to assist. The rear passenger window was shattered using a rescue tool. Inside, the driver was slumped against the seatbelt. A single gunshot wound was visible under the chin, exiting through the roof of the skull. A compact .380 caliber pistol lay in his lap, right index finger still loosely hooked to the trigger guard. Blood had dried along the base of the seat and pooled under the footwell. Time of death was estimated between 1 o'clock and 2:30 p.m., based on lividity and body temperature readings taken at the scene. It was Jason Cachuela, and he was already dead. The suicide location was less than 15 minutes from the original crime scene. The neighborhood was residential, quiet, lined with single-family homes. No one in the area reported hearing a gunshot. The windows had been rolled up, doors locked from the inside, and the weapon was a ghost gun, non-serialized, untraceable, matching the shell casings from Pearl Ridge. There was no suicide note, no confession, no manifesto. But the interior of the vehicle told its own story. The passenger seat held a folded photo, an old wedding portrait. Teresa in a white gown, Jason beside her. The image had been sliced diagonally with a blade. Her side of the photo was missing. Shreds of the paper were found scattered under the front mat. Investigators processed the vehicle. No prints were recovered from the firearm. The trigger and slide had been wiped clean. The gun was loaded with one live round in the chamber, no magazine. There were no spare cartridges found in the car. Forensics estimated that the weapon was fired once. A single casing was recovered from under the driver's seat, identical in manufacturer to those recovered at the mall. The vehicle's onboard diagnostics were accessed via a port scanner. Records confirmed engine ignition at 7:12 a.m. and shut off shortly after the presumed time of suicide. GPS tracking logs showed the car was driven to Pearl Ridge that morning, idled in the parking structure, exited at approximately 8:45 a.m., and arrived at Como Mai Drive at 9:12 a.m., less than 30 minutes after the homicide. Jason did not attempt to flee the island. He did not go home. He left no digital footprint after 9:15 a.m. The device he typically used, a Samsung phone, was not found on his person or in the car. Its last tower ping was recorded in the same Waipahu zone. Investigators suspect it was either destroyed or purposefully discarded prior to death. Back at HQ, detectives reviewed Jason's last known movements prior to the murder. Credit card statements, Toll logs and gas station receipts placed him in Capole the night before. One receipt from a convenience store included a timestamp of 11:09 p.m. on December 21st. Surveillance video from that location showed him alone, purchasing a bottle of water, chewing gum, and a prepaid Visa card. He was wearing the same hoodie seen in the Pearl Ridge surveillance footage. What was notable wasn't the transaction. It was what happened after. At 11:53 p.m., his Google search history, later recovered from cloud data, included the phrase, "Suicide with .380 pistol inside car." Investigators believe the sequence was intentional. The murder, the escape, the suicide. There was no sign of hesitation, no erratic behavior, no last-minute communication to family or friends, just silence. The medical examiner's report confirmed cause of death as intraoral gunshot wound. Trajectory was consistent with a downward angle from inside the mouth. The bullet exited through the cranial vault and embedded in the sealing fabric of the SUV. Ballistics matched the casing and projectile to the Pearl Ridge rounds. Time of death was placed within a 3-hour range, broad but aligning with the data retrieved from the car's engine log and GPS timestamps. Toxicology returned negative. No alcohol, no drugs, no sedatives. It was, in clinical terms, a clean suicide, one that didn't leave room for ambiguity or delay. One detective who reviewed the timeline remarked, "He knew what he was doing. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He planned his death with the same precision as the murder." And perhaps that's what made it harder to accept. There was no attempt at justification, no final message, just a methodical ending to a day that began with an ambush and ended with silence. There's a particular silence that follows a domestic homicide in a small community, not the quiet of peace, but of paralysis, an institutional hesitation, an official scrambling for control. In the wake of Teresa Cachuela's murder and Jason Cachuela's subsequent suicide, that silence was short-lived. By December 23, 2023, just one day after her killing, the Honolulu Police Department was already facing questions they couldn't answer with clarity or confidence. The shooting had occurred less than 48 hours after Teresa had been granted a temporary restraining order. That document, signed and stamped by a judge, should have functioned as a shield. Instead, it lay ineffective, unenforced, and ultimately irrelevant to the events that unfolded in a parking garage at Pearl Ridge Center. Internal law enforcement memos later revealed that the TRO had not yet been served to Jason Cachuela. It had remained an item in process, awaiting coordination between agencies that, by nature, weren't built for urgency. Teresa had done what victims are told to do. She documented the abuse, contacted authorities, and went through the process. In response, the system issued paper. But paper doesn't move people with intent. Jason had no legal obligation to stay away because he hadn't been officially notified. The law, in its rigid structure, requires that the respondent be served before enforcement mechanisms engage. Until then, the TRO was dormant. That gap proved fatal. Sources within the Honolulu Police Department, speaking under anonymity in early January 2024, confirmed that staffing shortages and backlog issues had delayed civil process service for over 48 hours. While investigators moved quickly on the homicide itself, Internal Affairs began reviewing procedural timelines. By the first week of January, HPD had launched a parallel audit into its family violence response structure. Autopsy reports finalized on January 6th confirmed what the ballistic evidence had already suggested. Jason fired multiple shots at close range. One bullet struck Teresa's neck, clean, lethal, and likely the first. Another impacted her shoulder. Her death was ruled a homicide by firearm. Toxicology on both individuals showed no presence of drugs or alcohol. But the story didn't stop at physical evidence. It carried into the digital realm. Jason's phone history was forensically extracted by HPD's Digital Evidence Recovery Team. The timeline painted a methodical preparation. On December 21st, the day after the TRO was issued, Jason had searched for how long until TRO takes effect Hawaii, Pearl Ridge parking level layout, and ghost gun storage legality. These weren't random. They were task-oriented, specific. Investigators concluded that Jason likely knew he had a narrow window to act before law enforcement served him. The timeline from search history to murder was a straight line. Of particular concern was the ghost gun itself. Lacking a serial number, it bypassed traditional background checks. Jason had assembled the weapon months earlier, according to receipts found in a cloud-synced email account investigators accessed post-mortem. Hawaii's legislation at the time had banned ghost guns, effective January 2022, but enforcement had been limited. The parts had arrived in a series of shipments, each small enough not to raise red flags. When confronted with these details, state legislators responded publicly. On January 8, 2024, Rep. Linda Ichiyama introduced new amendments to the ghost gun legislation, advocating for a more robust tracking system and mandatory reporting from online retailers shipping into Hawaii. The Cachuela case was cited directly on the floor of the House. Meanwhile, community advocates rallied. At least 3 vigils were held across Oahu. Domestic violence survivor networks, already stretched thin, used the moment to spotlight flaws in civil protection enforcement. Their message was consistent. Victims follow the process. The system needs to meet them at the finish line, not show up after their funerals. Within the Honolulu Family Court Division, procedural reviews began to tighten. By February 2024, a new pilot protocol was tested requiring mandatory electronic notification to defendants within 24 hours of TRO approval, followed by physical service when possible. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. Looking back, some investigators admitted privately that the signs of escalation had been underestimated. Jason wasn't hiding, one detective noted. He was building toward something. It was structured, and we missed it. Not for lack of care, but because the system isn't designed for people like him. It reacts. He acted. In criminal justice terms, this wasn't a failure of detection, it was a failure of speed. The mechanisms were in place. The paperwork was in process. But bureaucracy moves slower than violence. For survivors watching from afar, the case became more than just a cautionary tale. It was a systemic mirror. Teresa did everything she was advised to do. She reported, she documented, she filed. But in the space between filing and follow-through, her life was taken. There is no policy precise enough to prevent every act of premeditated domestic violence. But the Cachuela case exposed a vulnerability that was preventable. Not with new laws, but with faster application of the ones already written. As of July 2025, portions of the Honolulu PD's Family Violence Division have integrated real-time TRO service tracking and prioritized digital flagging of firearms-related restraining orders. It took a tragedy to make that happen. You can often tell when a case stops being just a crime and starts becoming a symbol. That's what happened within 48 hours of Teresa Cachuela's death. The official press releases were measured. A domestic murder-suicide at Pearl Ridge Center, a minor present, a history of protective filings. But online, the narrative escalated faster than the authorities could respond. By December 26, 2023, screenshots of Teresa's social media posts were being widely shared. These weren't leaks. They were public evidence she'd left behind. Posts about fear, about her estranged husband showing up uninvited, about filing for a TRO that critically had not yet been served. The digital trail was detailed, time-stamped, and damning. It wasn't the police building public understanding. It was the public itself. Local outlets like Civil Beat and Hawaii News now soon followed with pieces examining procedural failures. The framing moved from a personal tragedy to a systemic breakdown. This shift was driven not by speculation, but by data. TROs unserved in time, prior threats left unaddressed, and text messages that showed Teresa feared retaliation. Law enforcement eventually held a press conference confirming what many feared. The TRO was granted but not served before the shooting. Internal backlogs were cited. The public wasn't reassured. From a broader lens, Teresa's case began to spark legislative conversations. By January 2024, a formal resolution was introduced to audit all delayed TROs in the state. Advocacy groups called for updated threat detection procedures, especially in cases where prior firearm purchases and stalking behavior overlapped. Investigators, for their part, adapted. Teresa's digital evidence led HPD's cyber unit to pilot new protocols, early warning flags for escalating online behavior in domestic disputes, It wasn't sweeping reform, but it was a measurable shift, prompted by one case that refused to be buried under routine. This chapter wasn't about uncovering a killer. That was already done. It was about what happens when the facts are known, but the systems responsible for prevention are the ones under scrutiny. By the time March turned to April, the investigation into Rebecca Byler's death had reached its final turning point. The man arrested, Sean Cranston, was no longer just a suspect. He had been formally charged with 2 counts of homicide, one for Rebecca and one for her unborn child. His DNA, fingerprints, and digital trail tied him to the scene. It was clear, but justice never saw the courtroom. On April 10, 2024, Cranston died by suicide in his jail cell at Warren County Prison. No trial, no testimony, just an abrupt end to a case that had shaken northwestern Pennsylvania. For the Byler family, there would be no cross-examinations or closing statements, just a permanent absence and the quiet burden of unanswered questions. The authorities confirmed Cranston's connection to the family wasn't entirely random. While no official restraining orders existed, there were signs: troubling past behavior, disturbing internet searches, and texts recovered from his phone. The signs had been missed or ignored. In the wake of his death, the state responded. Pennsylvania's Senate introduced Resolution 18, pushing for a review of rural safety protocols and domestic violence response, especially in isolated communities like Spartansburg. It didn't mention Rebecca by name, but it didn't need to. Community-led efforts followed. Neighbors launched discreet safety campaigns. Amish families came together in memorials, their mourning silent but resolute. The impact of Rebecca's death spread well beyond the crime scene. It revealed how vulnerable life could be when systems fail and silence fills the gap. As the narrator, I've walked this timeline step by step. And if there's one truth that remains, it's this: no system should wait until the funeral to pay attention. What happened to Rebecca Byler reminds me that evil doesn't always knock loud. Sometimes it walks in when no one's looking. Quiet, calculated, and devastating. If you've followed this story to the end, then maybe, like me, you've realized something. Safety in America's quietest places should never be assumed. We all need to speak up when something feels off, even if it's uncomfortable. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What part of this story struck you the most? Was there a moment you wish had gone differently? Drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts or even where you're tuning in from. And if this video moved you or made you think twice about what we take for granted, hit subscribe and stick with me for more stories that matter,